Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 124 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today I'm speaking with Naveed Jamali. Naveed is currently an editor-at-large for Newsweek, where he reports on national security issues. Naveed grew up in New York City, where his parents owned a small business selling technical journals and other hard-to-find publications. This inadvertently put them in touch with Russian agents working under diplomatic cover at the Soviet mission to the United Nations, who were constantly seeking information on American research and development across a wide variety of issues. And it led Naveed himself to become the linchpin in an amazing FBI operation to catch one of these Russian agents in an act of espionage. I invited Naveed onto the podcast to discuss his time as a double agent working for both the FBI and the Russian GRU, which he covered in his book, How to Catch a Russian Spy, published in 2015. But before we begin, I want to ask you to consider something. Have you ever wished that your sunglasses protected you from more than just the sun? Maybe you're sitting in traffic and you're suddenly thinking about your airbag deploying. Sometimes we all wish we had this kind of durable protective gear with us, but we don't want to wear Oakley M frames every day that make us look like we're about to invade Fallujah. Well, my friends at Grayman and Company think the same way. They think about what they can do to provide more capability without compromising your classic aesthetic. Spies don't look tactical. James Bond doesn't look tactical. He looks stylish. He looks elegant. Grayman and Company make impact-resistant sunglasses, including prescription lenses, as well as cut-resistant gloves, merino polo shirts, and custom-tailored suits with all sorts of features for guys who might need to look their best but be ready for anything. Check them out at grayman.co. The sunglasses have been huge sellers and more are arriving soon. And use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 for 10% off your order. Naveed, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. I've had your book on my bookshelf for a long time now, probably over 2 years, and I'm very happy that we were able to get in touch to discuss it.
Likewise.
So I want to go back to your childhood because that's where not just it began for you, but where this story began as well. So can you tell me a little bit about growing up in New York City?
So, I'm sort of this odd combination of a French mother and a Pakistani father. My father came here on a Fulbright scholarship from Pakistan, ended up teaching NYPD ethics, and then formed a small company. I was born in New York, but I grew up right outside of it, and a very typical suburban childhood, obviously with one interesting notable caveat, which is early on in my childhood, the Soviets made contact with my parents and started this sort of weird long-term relationship with the Soviets, then the Russians with my parents, and then with me. And so, but besides that, if you can say this, it was pretty suburban typical, if you will.
So this relationship, I mean, it's unusual and it's noteworthy and it's what we're here to discuss, but it also was like a once every couple of months kind of thing. Do I recall that correctly from the book?
That is correct. So, in a lot of ways, what we're talking about here, and I'm sure as a practitioner of the dark arts, if you will, a lot of it that people are sort of surprised and maybe even a little disappointed to learn is that it's very, intelligence and spying is very bureaucratic. So what I mean by that is that the Soviets and of course then the Russians, what they were doing was intelligence collection. And intelligence collection in many ways is very bureaucratic. So what my parents were for the Soviets was reliable in the sense that they could continuously, with what they believe without the fear of detection, continuously collect stuff. And so, when you're reporting back to the Soviet Union from New York, you need to show a level of intelligence collection. So we always assumed that this was just easy stuff for them to get reliably, to sort of dump up and pump up their numbers. And so, they came every month, which if you think about the levels of work that they had to do to make sure they weren't being shadowed, which in this case they were, it was not an insignificant effort to, perhaps the most riskiest part of clandestine or spy operations is when, an asset is in touch with their handler. And so that contact is very, very dangerous. So yes, it was every few months. But if you think about that, that's actually a pretty significant continuous thing, especially since it went on for decades.
Right, right. They kind of established a pattern, and someone picked up on it, obviously, as we'll get into that.
Yep.
So, can you talk about these manuals and that sort of thing that they were picking up? I mean, obviously, it was like all unclassified stuff, but
Yep.
it was still valuable to them.
Sure. So, the sort of saying in the intelligence community is that your enemies may know what you're looking for in terms of intelligence collection, but your friends are the ones that you really are the ones you trust with and what you need. There's what you want and what you need, those gaps. And so even though it was low level, I wouldn't say low level, but there's also a misunderstanding about classified and unclassified. Just because something is unclassified, especially in the 80s when this is going on, there was things like trade restrictions. So, you can remember the Soviets and the Chinese. Even to this day, the Chinese are not allowed to buy certain pieces of technology. And so even though this was unclassified stuff, there was a need to get content that was export controlled. So actually, many people might be interested to learn that a lot of the stuff that is quote unquote espionage is not classified, but it falls under trade embargoes, trade restrictions. There's certain things you're just technology transfers that you're not allowed to sell outside the United States. And so the Soviets, while they weren't collecting classified information, they were certainly collecting content and information that they were forbidden from acquiring. And so they were in fact breaking the law. And, the fact that they felt that they could do this without the prying eyes of the FBI, although they were mistaken, is why they kept coming back.
Right, right. So how did the FBI factor into this? Was it right from the beginning, or did it take a while for that to emerge?
Yeah, it did happen literally the first time that the Soviets made contact with my father. My father used to tell the story of, just they had for those who know New York, he had an office in Columbus Circle, and it was, a typical small office. They were a small business. They didn't get walk-ins. They didn't have people coming in. They dealt with back then fax orders and things of that nature. And they would, acquire content, ship it. So, for example, if Annapolis wanted to buy books for their incoming freshman class, they would my father's company would fill the order. So one day out of the blue, they had this man walk in, and he asked to speak to my father by name. He introduced himself as this gentleman from the Soviet mission from the United Nations. He didn't even say the Soviet mission. He showed my father a business card that said Soviet mission to the United Nations. And he took the business card back. He wouldn't even give the business card to my father, and said that, we want to buy some books, and your name has been recommended and people speak very highly of it. And my father would always say, I have no idea why he picked me or how he found me and why he thought such highly things of me and who was speaking to the Soviet KGB at the time about me. And he gave my father a list of books. And the list of books was, was like academic things about nuclear disarmament and arms proliferation and things of that nature. And the gentleman said, I'm with the UN and arms control. And my father said, how is that going? He said, it's going okay. I said, okay, well, I'll get you your books. How should I get them? I'll be in touch. And with that, he left. And my father's thinking, wow, this is great. I just got a new client and I didn't have to do anything. And, kind of went back to work. And as he would tell the story, a few minutes later, there was another knock on the door and two more men came in and both dressed in trench coats. And father was like, what's going on here? And the men showed a picture of the man who's just came in. He said, this man is a KGB colonel. What did he want? And my father said, just to buy some books. And so he shared the list with the FBI. And he said to the FBI, what do you want me to do? And they said, Mr. Jamali, get him his books. And if he comes back, we'll be in touch. And that literally, from that one day, that started this, 2-decade long relationship between my parents, the Soviets and the Russians and the FBI, and then myself, the Russians and the FBI. But yeah, it's all started one sort of innocuous day.
Amazing stuff. Really changed the course of your life, certainly.
Totally.
In such an odd way. So did things just proceed in that manner for the next few years? Like he comes and buys books and then your father tells the FBI agents what books he bought, something along those lines?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, it was sort of, one should understand that the Russians that were dealing with my father were, and this is all stuff I understand much later after kind of being in the community a little bit, but it's taskings, right? So the Soviets that were coming in, and first of all, just like any diplomat, they'd be posted here for a couple of years. So every few years, one would leave and a new one would come in, and they'd come and make, introductions, and the cycle would begin. But for the Soviets, they were giving tasking. So someone somewhere back in Russia, would say, we need to find out things about this type of metal or this type of radar. And they would put together a tasking that would eventually make its way to the Soviet intelligence officer who would put it on a list and give it to my father. So for the U.S. to see that list What it told them is that this is something that was an intelligence gap. It is something that the Soviets not only needed to know, but it was information they didn't currently have. And that in of itself is very useful if you're thinking about, this is the Cold War, right? We could be going to war with this. And this, again, those intelligence gaps help you design things that, again, for us sitting in New York City and just selling books, we had no concept of it. But these are things that actually have a significant impact on the national security. And that, you now know that the Soviets have this gap. They may have a radar that has a deficiency, or they don't know how to counter a U.S., particular coating on an aircraft, and they're looking for that. And so I'm sure that analysts back here were studying the list and determining what that meant in terms of gaps. But yeah, to your question, Justin, that's exactly what happened, is that one meeting sort of set off this sort of repeated sort of ongoing relationship. And while the Soviet intelligence officers would cycle back and forth, as would the FBI special agents, the business stayed the same.
We'll be right back.
As long as there have been secrets, there have been spies. And as long as there have been spies, there have been incredible gadgets. If you enjoy learning about the history of espionage, then make sure you're not missing out on another great new podcast series as well, titled A History of the World in Spy Objects from Spyscape Studios. Each episode covers an incredible tool or device and its real-world use, including the infamous Bulgarian poison-tipped umbrella, the Aston Martin DB4, the Enigma machine, and even the B-2 stealth bomber. The series is hosted by historian Alice Loxton from History Hit TV and includes commentary from Daniel Arsham, Anthony Horowitz, Jason Isaacs, and Thomas Heatherwick. A hidden history of the world itself begins to emerge as we are brought closer to the fiercely guarded secrets of intelligence communities. Listen to A History of the World in Spy Objects, hosted by Alice Loxton from Spyscape Studios, available now wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, I see. And so was there any give and take from the FBI? Like, were they offering anything in exchange for this, or was your father just kind of doing his patriotic duty by, passing information along?
So my parents were interesting a lot. They're both immigrants. My father became an American while he was a naturalized green card holder for many, many years. He became an American citizen of all times, November 2001. So yeah, and prior to that, he was at Columbia University, and very much, protested the Vietnam War. But both my parents felt this strong duty to their new homeland, that they had to do the right thing, but not too much, right? So what I mean by that is the Soviets, as would the FBI, would periodically come in, and the Soviets would say, "Hey, can you get this document?" And my father would be like, "It's classified. I can't get it for you." Or, "Can we do this for you?" Like, no, you don't need to do anything extra. Or the FBI would say, "Can we take you out to dinner? Can we do?" No, it's quite all right. You don't need to do anything for us. So the FBI never did anything for them, never paid them, helped them with nothing. They just felt that they wanted to keep this they felt that the FBI asked them to keep tabs on the Soviets, and they felt that it was their duty to do so. But they didn't ever want to sit down with the Soviets and expand that relationship. So yeah, for a decade plus, it stayed in this status quo where everyone was sort of happy. The Soviets were getting, and then the Russians were getting the information that they were looking for, and the FBI was able to keep tabs on the Soviets and the Russians.
Fascinating stuff. So how did you get directly involved in this? Because you were very young. I guess you were a young teenager when this started?
Yeah. The Russians, if I can take one step back and go to sort of modern times. When I wrote this book and I sat down with some colleagues who were in the intelligence community, and I said, I had a very frank discussion. I said, look, do I have anything to worry about from the Russians when I write this book? And I got two separate instances. One who was a retired former head of FBI counterintelligence said, look, Naveed, the Russians aren't going to do anything to you as long as you follow the simple rule. Don't humiliate them. Like, they're going to let you take your victory lap, and that's okay. And everyone expects that, but don't go beyond that. Don't make it a point of humiliating them. That's where the line for them is crossed. And then I asked another friend who was also within the intelligence community and had experience with this sort of stuff. And I said, do I have anything to worry about? And he said, no, not from the Russians. If they want to do anything to you, they'll subcontract it out to the Bulgarians. And I was going on my tour for the full year when the book came out. I would just say, when I'd go to Europe and things, I'd say, like, yeah, I'm happy to do it. Can I just ask it? Just if there's any Bulgarians, can we just make sure that I'm aware of it? So the reason I bring this up, Justin, is because, it was unique. And but it was also incredibly intimidating. And one of the things that my dad did to not freak us out was to use humor and to sort of make a joke about it. Like, it's the absurdity of it. But the Russians, it's important to understand, they can be very menacing. So as a young boy, again, the Russians would come to my parents' office in New York City. And we lived about 15 miles north in Westchester, New York. So the suburbs of New York.
Okay.
The Soviets had never been invited to my parents' house. There's no reason to think that they knew where we lived. And yet there we were one day shopping in our local A&P, and my father's walking with me, and there goes the Russian, just walks in front of him in the supermarket. And there were other times we'd be outside in our yard, and there's a car going back, and my father would say, "It looks like it's the Russian. How do they know where we live?" And it was very, very clear. Like, those were not mistakes. That's how the Russians work. It's messaging. It's messaging in a very menacing way. Hey, we know where you live. Hey, we know where you shop. And while it's not a direct threat, it clearly, to my father, it freaked him out. And so his reaction was to kind of joke about it. And I think that sort of kind of led me to be able to do a lot of this, is that for a lot of this, I found it to be a big joke and sort of absurd, the absurdity of it. But to make no mistake, like, the Russians they're pretty scary people when they want to be.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, they are able to reach out and touch people. They have many times in the past when they have a good enough motivation or a serious enough
Absolutely.
motivation for it. Man. So that brings us to you as I guess you're in your early 20s
That's
at
right.
this
Yeah.
point.
Out of college. Yep. Out of college. This is literally the very, very late 1900s. I graduated in 1999 from New York University, and it was the .com era, and sort of this listless time for me where I had a pretty good job offer. I ended up at Harvard with my now wife, and I was working there, and it was all kind of easy and good, but it felt sort of not terribly fulfilling. And then, of course, for my generation, September 11th happened. And living in Boston and having September 11th happen, it was the child of two immigrants. Like, New York City was like, there's no other place in the world that someone like me can thrive than New York City. So it was this very personal, I think, for a lot of us. But for me, the attack on New York City was not the attack. The September 11th wasn't just an attack on the U.S. It was an attack literally on my home, because it's where I lived.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt this real calling to do something. I wanted to join the military, and I found this intelligence program in the Navy and applied, and I didn't get in. And sort of crestfallen, I went back to my recruiter, my Navy recruiter, and he was like, "Hey, man, if you want to get into this, you might have to try. You might have to try a couple of times, and don't get discouraged. Don't give up. If there's something you really want, put the work into it, and you can reapply. You just have to show some sort of growth." So I got myself into graduate school in Harvard, and I kind of hated it. So I came up with this alternative idea, which is, we'd moved back to New York City, and I made contact with two FBI agents. And I said, I'm working at the family business, and, I know the Russians are here. And do you think if I help you with them, like, you might consider writing me a letter of recommendation for the Navy? And I often joke that, like, those two FBI agents, like, the minute they left, they must have been high-fiving, because here's someone who's willing to do, he's no idea what he's getting himself into, and he's willing to do this for a letter of recommendation. I know the joke is, like, normally people do this because they're trying to get out of jail, right? Like, they've never paid taxes, and here I am, letter of recommendation. Like, I probably should have asked for more, but I didn't know anything better at the time. So that's what I started with, and yeah, that literally is what started this trajectory of getting into it. Is I wanted to join the Navy, and I felt like this was, like an internship almost.
Man, that's incredible. I've not heard of anybody pursuing anything like that, but that also would most definitely have set you apart from all of the other candidates for this program, which was
Well,
clearly
yeah.
competitive. So you were really using your brain there, honestly.
I appreciate that. I can tell you that fast forward, when it was really important. So one of the things that kept me grounded through the whole operation was like, hey, this is what I'm doing this for. But the reality, Justin, is like, this was so intense and so like intriguing that I would have done it for nothing. But it just was a way of, like, justifying things that I were doing that had no justification, right? But I will tell you, there was a point that came with the FBI when I would go interview with these, like, 06s, which is the equivalent of a captain or a colonel for this program. And before I would I would go in, these two FBI agents would come in and to these intelligence, Navy intelligence officers, like, hey, you're about to interview some guy. We're recommending him. He's really important. He's important to the, national security of the country and all. They'd say all these things. And then they'd say, we can't tell you what he's doing, but his name is Naveed Jamali. And then they'd leave. And I'd go in, and you could tell these senior officers were like, what the fuck is this guy? And they all thought it was terrorism. And so I had to tell I was like, guys, you can't do that. You're not helping me. You're making it worse. Like, maybe change your tune here, because they think that you like jammed me up trying to buy a Ryder van, or a Hertz,
Oh my gosh.
like filled with nitrate, ammonia nitrate. Like, don't do that. So yes, it was truly like my wife says it was, she's truly patriotism, and it was. I really wanted to join the Navy, but I think there are probably a lot easier ways to get into the intelligence community than the route I chose. It was very much
Yeah.
a non-linear one.
Yeah. Fascinating. Amazing stuff. So did you then suggest how you could help, or did they already need somebody to do what you ended up doing? I mean, how did that work? How did that relationship develop?
And again, you're talking about from the FBI standpoint.
Yes. Yes.
So again, people might be disappointed to hear. Listen, it's like the first time you get into a skiff, right? You're like, oh my god, I'm going to get all the secrets. I'm going to find out who killed kill JFK. And I remember people being like, hey, you should look up, Area 50. Look up whatever you want, and you're not going to find anything, right? Because it's like you're in one level, and there's so many other levels of stuff that's compartmentalized. You're not going to get access to that. So it's the same thing here. Is that you might think that it's this sexy sort of world, but the FBI, they're like, hey man, we got a good thing going. This thing of us being surveilled, the Russians, and then prior to that, the Soviets, have been going for 15 years at this point. Don't fuck it up. Like, just kind of don't rock the boat. We like watching what they're asking for. It's building our quota too. We have a quota too. So initially, Justin, they did not want me to change anything. They really just wanted me to kind of keep the status quo. And they were like, don't do anything. But I was young, I was brash, and I was kind of dumb with this, and incredibly naive. And I was like, no, I think I can progress the relationship. We can do something bigger here. And I tried. And I was honestly a little bit, very much the chagrin of the FBI.
Yeah. They're like, oh no, we should not have agreed to that memorandum.
No.
Wow. So what did happen? How did that relationship change with the Russians? Because I assume it was a new guy now that, was not the one that you initially approached your parents.
Yeah. So it was a Russian Navy captain by the name of Oleg Kulikov. And so there are things, that I've learned subsequent to my time doing this. And Kulikov was an incredibly important person within the GRU community. So one of the things that I was surprised to learn, for example, is that when it comes to intelligence officers, or IOs, for the United States, part of the big cadre of intelligence officer, of intelligence collection, happens, yes, at the embassy, and of course there are consulates, right? And there's been history of the U.S. shutting over the last few years, Russian consulates and seizing buildings and things of that nature. But the place that continues to be a veritable ongoing source of foreign intelligence collection is the United Nations. Now, I don't mean the United Nations proper, but I mean the staff assigned to the United Nations by various countries, in this case, the Russians, right? So Oleg Kulikov and his boss, General Nikolai Urivov, who was the senior GRU officer in the United States, was assigned to the Russian mission to the United Nations. So the head GRU collection, the head GRU officer in the United States, was assigned to the United Nations. And I have no doubt to this day, Justin, that even though the people have been replaced, the Russian intelligence collection continues on. And I'm sure if you were to look at the UN book today and look at who is the senior flag officer, general officer for the Russians assigned to the United Nations, all public, I'm sure that person is in fact a GRU officer. And I'm sure that they are continuing their intelligence collection. So it's just important to know that New York sort of remains this hotspot for this type of stuff, and the Russians assigned to the mission here in New York are off doing that. And so, getting back to your question about what changed, so Oleg Kulikov showed up, and I could tell, sort of arrogant guy. I was in my 20s, he was in my 40s. He looked like an old man at the time, which is the irony, of course, there. That so he shows up, and I could tell he didn't really give a crap about this. Like, he was just, this is his old account. It's just a numbers thing. And then, when I started talking to him about my background and I want to join the Navy, you could tell there was something that shifted. But he was so paranoid. And what literally made the change was that Oleg had done something that had never happened in the decade plus of the Soviets and the Russians coming to my parents' office, is that he invited me to meet outside of the office. And that shift was a monumental one from being sort of this low level, repeatable asset to now you're going through the Russian process of being recruited and being vetted and being interrogated. And so getting me out where he could sit one on one, where they could do surveillance and counter surveillance, that was the fundamental shift that changed the nature and the trajectory of our relationship.
Hmm. Yeah, I can imagine. I'm sure the FBI really perked up with that as well. So, what did he want to meet with you out there for? I mean, did he reveal that pretty quickly, or did it take a while?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there was a shift, right? So the Russians were using the company to get open source, trade restricted information. And where the shift happened was between using me to get information and using me to be a directed, controlled asset, right? So it's one thing to give a list of books. It's another thing to be like, hey, you join the military, you're going to put orders to this command. And when you go to this command, we're going to want you to look at this stuff and go for,
Oh yeah.
so it's a total, and so you asked about him revealing himself. Basically, the answer is what shifted is that they now became interested in not my ability to collect information from them to process book orders, but to be a vetted asset, a vetted, controlled asset.
Hmm.
In essence, a spy. That's the thing that it slowly revealed itself to me is that every time I meet with him, Justin, these were like no joke, literal interrogations to check for any deception. Because if you lie about the small stuff, you certainly can't be trusted with the big stuff.
Sure, sure. So, how long did this play out? I mean, I'm assuming it was a series of meetings. Was it over weeks or months or years even?
Yeah, it was over. This is something that took years. The Russians, it, spying is this weird thing in that it only takes one person, right? Like you can have one spy that can do, even in the history of civilization. You can just look at it. Just one person can have a tremendous impact. So yeah, they were in no rush. They were not going to work on our timetable. They were going to work on their timetable. And so this was a series of meetings over the course of several years till it took to the point where I was now the equivalent of like a mobster, a made man, right? I was in the network. I was a trusted quant, but it was a slow dance. And I think that, again, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but now I understand this. There are very few people that get to make it through that process to become like a trusted Russian spy. And that's exactly what it was.
Oh, so it takes years for him to get to the point where he can truly trust you. But when does it get to the point that he actually asks you for something like big, like a actual espionage activity? Did he kind of reveal
Yeah,
his intentions anyway?
it is a slow workup, right? So part of it, you're absolutely right. So part of it is just the continual testing about your answers, seeing if your story is going to deviate, seeing how you respond to certain things, seeing when you meet with them if you're being followed, if you're recording them, all sorts of things, right? And you're right to ask about the what you would call a tasking. The way that I was tasked is that when it came to the end of the operation, if you will, the Soviets, excuse me, the Russians. That's a Freudian slip because in my mind, you know, for the Cold War, a lot of people think that the Cold War ended. I can tell you, for the Russians, it did not.
Hmm.
So it's easy replace one and the other. So, the tasking. Get back to your question about the tasking. It came in a document that I still have to this day, which is they presented me with this document that showed all the U.S. levels of not just classification, but we call special access programs, and it showed from like just having a secret all the way up to the president. They had this like step chart, and it was like all the names, the type of special access. It was crazy,
Hmm.
and it was all like handwritten, and he gave it to me. And he's like, when you're a Navy intelligence officer, you'll be here. Here's where you'll be. And here's the kind of information we're going to want to have. And we're going to, we're so excited to bring you into the family. We're going to have a party for you. And I mean, at this point, I knew the whole thing was going to end. But like, that was the point where it was real. Like, they intended me to do is to be in a place that had access to some of our, you know, our nation's most sensitive and closely guarded secrets. And their expectation was that I was gonna, stuff my blouse with whatever stuff I get my hands on and give it to them.
Hmm. Okay, amazing. And throughout this time, you also have this relationship with the FBI. So, can you tell me how that kind of progressed along the way?
Yeah, it's this weird thing in that you do this work and there's very few people that know you're doing it. It's a very lonely operation, it's a very lonely game. In my case, I had two FBI case officers who were my lifeblood. I mean, like literally, I trusted them with my life. And to put things in perspective, I sort of averaged out that for every hour I spent with Oleg Kulikov, it was probably like 100 man hours that I spent with the FBI agents
Oh my God.
planning out what we are going to do. So that relationship, like we had to get along. And it's not that we were friends, but it's that I had to trust them and they had to trust me, right? Because I would often tell them, like, you can't give me a script. It's not natural. The Russians are going to know. You just have to trust me to have the conversation the way that works for me. And they did. And I had to trust them that I'd often ask the FBI agents, like, hey man, is this guy armed? Is Oleg armed? And they're like, what do you think? I'm like, if I knew, I wouldn't
Mhm.
be asking. And they wouldn't tell me. To this day, they still, which just tells me assumes that he probably was.
Oh man.
But it, very much it was in many ways the relationship with the FBI was one that was nurtured and I trusted them and I still stay in touch with some of these agents to this day, many, many years later. So there's a bond that puts you in there because I put my life and my family, my wife's life in their hands. It's not a small part for them to protect me. It's not a small part for them to trust me to walk into places and know that I'm there doing their bidding and putting
Hmm.
myself at risk. So I like to think that while it might have been difficult, it was a two-way trust.
Yeah, yeah. So I can certainly see that. So on the subject of your wife, did she know what you were doing at this time, or did your parents know since
So,
they already had that relationship with the FBI?
my parents, it's an interesting thing is, like I said, it really is this lonely medium, right? On one hand, I'm this young guy who just got married and trying to build a career and a life. And on the other hand, I'm doing something completely that is all consuming. And so I remember the FBI was like, hey, if you need to talk to your wife about this, that's totally fine. And they made it sound so easy. And and many years later, I found out when I was going for my security clearance, I found out that they actually gave her a security clearance so that she could talk. And they never told me about this,
Huh.
but that was sort of the way that I was able to talk to her about what was going on. So she did know what I was doing. But to their credit and to my parents' credit, who my father, who made this seem like no big deal, I didn't really get flustered by it. I didn't get like, you know, so because I was cool with it and sort of even keeled, she never got worried about it. But she absolutely didn't know, and we talk about it, and I'd stress about it about in the same way that one might find a difficult coworker, right? Like, oh, these guys drive me nuts, or Oleg is driving me nuts, or they call me and they expect me to be there, like that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And it became very pedestrian,
Hmm.
which is probably why I was able to do this for almost 3 years.
Okay. Very cool. So I want to go back to Oleg for a moment. What did he believe was your own motivation for doing all of this? Like, was he having
Yeah,
to pay you at every meeting or something?
Yeah, so this is a this is a tough thing, Justin. Like, the one thing people might be surprised to learn is I often get this is, oh, you were a former spy. Well, you must lie all the time. I'm like, no, no. In fact, the one thing you cannot do around the Russians or the FBI, and not because it's illegal or the Russians will kill you, is lie. Is because they're constantly, both of them are constantly on the lookout for deception. And when it comes to Oleg, like he was, man, was he good at that. Like there were times he would shake my hand as he's holding my hand. He'd ask me a question, look me dead in the eyes. And man, you can't lie. I
Hmm.
think the only reason that the Russians didn't know that I was working for the FBI is because they never asked me. I think that if they had asked me, I probably would have, I hate to say it, I probably would have confessed. They just never asked me. And to Oleg's point, to your question about like, why do you think I was doing it? That was the thing that was perhaps both the trickiest, but also the linchpin to the success of this whole operation. It was making the Russians believe that the reason I was doing this was something that they could understand. The reality of the reason I was doing this is because I wanted that letter of recommendation to join the Navy. But I
Hmm.
couldn't tell I couldn't tell the Russians that. So I came up in reading, books much as you have, right? Sort of this amateur spy. I came across, and I can't remember what book it was, but this acronym MICE. MICE, money, ideology, coercion, ego. And those are sort of understood to be the cornerstones of motivation for people who spy. And I said, well, I'm not an ideologue. Oleg's not really coercing me, but money and ego, that's a character I can play. So I made the Russians believe that I was this young, brash kid. I had a Corvette at the time, and like that I was after this because I wanted the money and because, damn it, I was smarter than the FBI. And that's sort of the story I told them. And that, like, maybe, and I got it by watching all these movies, all these Michael Mann movies, and Spy Game, and Miami Vice, and the modern James Bond with Daniel Craig. And I lifted all the, in many cases, lifted the dialogue from these movies and used it. And I don't know if the Russians were watching the same movies and that's what they expected. So, a young American, but it worked. Like, the idea of an American who was driven by money and ego, like, totally made sense to them. Totally made sense to them. And there was never a question, honestly, about why I was doing this. They understood it.
Okay. Yeah, I can certainly see that. And did you ever receive any, or did you have to use any tradecraft with him, or did the FBI give you any tradecraft for the meetings, anything like that? I mean, you were not yet a careerist, like you
Right.
said. You had not really.
I was an amateur.
With feet.
Yeah. And in fact, part of the thing the FBI would say to me is like, they know, for example, Oleg was an avid swimmer. He would go to the pool where he lived in in their compound up here in New York City, and he would swim. And I guess the FBI was watching this, but they said, we can't even us telling you that, we have to be so careful about telling you anything about him, because if anything we tell you slips into conversation and there's no reason for you to have known that, you could, the most innocuous fact. Oh, Oleg, you're a swimmer. Well, how do you know that, Naveed?
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that's like this constant drumbeat of sort of censoring yourself. But so Spycraft, there was no way for me I couldn't get trained. Although I did go to a couple of places, do some stuff, I went to a State Department. I don't know if I wrote about this in the book, but I went to a State Department training course, and I was able to use that as something that I was able to pass the Russians. But there was nothing that I was like fundamentally trained. And I think that had I used traditional dyed-in-the-wool tested spycraft, I think that would have stood out to the Russians.
Yeah,
the fact that this was so like unscripted, not from the FBI playbook, which, by the way, the FBI, if you think that, that the FBI is just like innovative in a lot of ways, there, again, I go back to that thing about bureaucracy. They're just not. There's just this monolith. So to your question about spycraft, the fact that I made up my own spycraft, I think, is, again, what made it past the Russian sort of detection looking for FBI fingerprints. But yeah, man, like, the FBI gave me a watch and back then this was a big deal, a watch that I was recording everything. There's definitely things that I had to do, in terms of leaving meetings, driving really fast and pulling to the side of the road to make sure you weren't being followed. There were things that I did, but these are all things that, like, I just figured out on my own. No one was telling me to do them. And I think that if I had known the specific things, the Russians would have just picked up on this like that.
Yeah, I can see that what you were doing was organic and authentic, and they would be able to sense that, I would imagine.
Totally.
Cool. Very cool. So how did things ultimately come to a head in your relationship with Olga? I mean, it was a limited timeline on this thing.
It was
expiration date, right?
Absolutely. And, again, I was crestfallen when it came to a close. But as I mentioned the onset of our interview, listen, Oleg was under diplomatic cover, right? He was, on paper, he was a diplomat, even though it's all BS. He was not. He was a spy handler. But just like all diplomats, he had a shelf life of how long he was going to stay here. And the FBI, even though it's counterintelligence in the National Security Division, they have to approach this by the rule of law. And in fact, as a funny aside, many years later, when I tried to get my FBI file, which I got pieces of it, I asked to get the file from Oleg, and the FBI was like, "Well, do you have a release from him? Has he signed a release allowing us to give you?" And I just thought, again, that level of absurdity. Wow. But coming back to sort of how it ended, is Oleg, again, that bureaucracy. His tour in the United States was up. He was set to leave. And the FBI, the State Department, the CIA, many years later, when I was in the intelligence community, I ran into someone who was an FBI sort of surveillance tech, and he was working in DC, and he remembers, although he had no idea why it was, that they got called in on a Sunday. And that was the Sunday that I went to meet Oleg for the last time. And the FBI had decided that they were going to let the Russians know that this operation had been compromised. And that entailed me meeting with Oleg and being arrested by the FBI in front of him. And it was this sort of crazy moment, all of it was this I mean, it was cinematic, but it was intense in the moment, and you almost feel like it's an out of body experience. But it ended in of all places in Wayne, New Jersey, and I met Oleg. He had decided that we were going to meet at there's always these shitty mid tier fast food places, a Pizzeria Uno's. Blown off the last meeting because the FBI did not want me to go to meet with him because they were still arguing with the State Department about like who could do what. Could they talk to Oleg? Could they put their hands on him? So all this crazy, and for me, just dealing with two FBI agents, now there's all these massive agencies and senior people who are like weighing in and things that are way, way above me. But now I'm seeing it, right? I didn't know any of this stuff existed. So we blow off the first meeting. They make me sit in a parking lot. They being the FBI, make me sit in a parking lot with them to make sure that I wouldn't go meet with the Russians until he leaves. Calls me again a few weeks later. Okay, the meeting's on. Drive out to Wayne, New Jersey. I planned with the FBI. We're going to be in this restaurant. And they were like, there's a lot of arguments between me and them. Like, they wanted to arrest me in the restaurant. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, what if someone recognized it? Like, that's just a terrible idea. So we're going to do it on the car. Once we had this entire plan, Justin. You've heard the saying, like, no plan survives first contact. And that's exactly what happened here. I show up at the appointed time. I'm walking in. I'll never forget these giant, heavy wood doors with these wrought iron like handles. And I'm going to reach for the handle to get inside. And I look and I hear my name. And I look and there's Oleg. He's waiting for me outside. And he shakes my hand. And as he's shaking my hand, he says, "Hey, Naveed, do you mind if we go to a different restaurant?" And I'm like panicking inside. And he's looking at me. And I couldn't portray any emotion. I said, "No, of course not." But inside, I was like, "Oh my God, what is going to happen?" There's a whole bunch of FBI agents inside. They're going to see me walking. They're not going to know where I'm going or what I'm doing. And of course, he takes me to Hooters, which is across the street. So it was like the farthest, longest 100 feet I've ever had to walk. And the FBI, to their credit, didn't do anything. We go inside. We have this conversation. It's noisy. I can barely hear him. He's telling me like, I'm leaving, but I'm so happy there's so many people within the organization that want to meet you. And I was like, "Hey, I've got more stuff for you. It's in my car." And he's like really excited. And what I didn't know at the time is the FBI was scrambling, right? So there's all these agents in that other restaurant. And they all, of course, all got their food to go. They had to wait for it to get given to them in doggy bags and then run out. And finished having a lunch with Oleg. And I'm like, "Let's walk to the car. I'm going to give you something. It's in the back of the car." And so I'm walking and we get to this like curb and I can see the car. It's maybe 15 feet in front of me. And I stop and he's telling me how they're going to throw this lavish party for me with lobsters and champagne. And I still regret to this day that I never had that party. And he gives me like $15,000. I mean, it's like this big thing. And he's super excited. He's like, "I'm leaving, but you're going to meet all these great people." And I was like, "Okay, well, let me give you the stuff." And now I knew when he got to the car, I had a box of stuff and there was nothing in it. It was just stuff he'd seen before. It was F-14 manuals. He'd already seen those. And the sign was, "Get to the car," and I take my hat off. And so we do that. It's like 3:00 on a Sunday in Wayne, New Jersey, in a parking lot in a mall, strip mall. He opens the trunk. He looks in. He reaches out. I take my hat off. These cars come screeching out. These Ford Fusions. I'll never forget it. They grab me and they start patting me down like they're going to arrest me. They throw me in the back. These FBI agents I'd never seen before. And I can see that my main case officer's like staring down Oleg. And he's like, but they don't touch him. They can't do anything. And Oleg, who had just been telling me minutes ago how important I was to the organization, how excited people were, turns his back, never looks at me, and walks away.
Oh,
and
wow.
I never so it was just like that. They were once you have no value to them, you have no value to them. And so the FBI agents were driving the car, and as we turned the corner out of the parking lot, they all turned to me and started high-fiving me and congratulations. And they bring me up to this parking lot, and there's felt like it was 100 people there. It was crazy. And they're surveilling him as he leaves, and like, "You can't leave yet. You can't leave. Okay, now you can go." And it was just this surreal thing. And I think they followed, it was under surveillance the whole way home. And it ended just like that. So 3 years of this intense buildup. And I can tell you, the FBI agents I worked with were pissed. They felt that we had done something significant that had never really been done before. and they wanted to continue on with the operation. And I think we were all really crestfallen that we couldn't continue on because I was young. But the reality, Justin, is that knowing now, like, I, I'm glad it ended. I didn't have any kids, young, late 20s. It's not an old man's game. It takes a lot out of you, and suppressing normal feelings of danger for 3 years, it has an impact. And it took me many years later to realize that I was doing things that were not normal. But at the time, man, I didn't want it to stop. I wanted to keep going. It was a rush. It was a high to do this stuff. And the FBI agents that I worked with felt the same way. We were all disturbed. We never quite figured out why they put the brakes on it, other than that fear, that aversion to risk. Oleg was leaving. His replacement, they don't know if he was going to make contact with me. They don't know if he was going to do anything that was quote unquote illegal. So they may not be able to PNG the next guy. They got this guy here. They can PNG him, persona non grata. They can do stuff to him because he's here now. When he leaves, their legal ability to do anything goes away. And so the decision, I believe, was made to shut it down in that manner because Oleg was literally leaving in a few weeks. And there was a fear that his replacement maybe never makes contact with me. So, yeah.
Yeah, I can understand that perspective. And it's unfortunate for almost everybody involved, but it does make sense from a certain point of view.
It does. It does.
So is that what happened then? Oleg, like a couple of days later, he got the PNG notice officially or something?
From what I've heard, Oleg did not have a happy trip back. He certainly didn't have a happy, because you got to think about this. Oleg was not just running me, right? So you try to keep things separate, right? Because you never want compromise. But I can tell you, Oleg there would be people that would call me from certain numbers, that certain safe houses, right? And the fact that Oleg was known. Oleg wasn't just working with me. Oleg wasn't just calling me. He wasn't just using those phones to call me. So when you start having those nodes of the network that are discovered by the FBI, you're able to uncover other things that aren't known, right? Other people that aren't controlled. As you know, Ghost Stories, which is Anna Chapman, that happened shortly thereafter, and the illegals and all that stuff. From what I understand, there was a connection to Oleg. So it just shows you how something so minor, a shared telephone number, a shared safe house, can expose so many operations. So yeah, Oleg was sent back to Russia, but from what I understand, the Russians had to, because of what happened here with me, they had to sort of shut down and decide what had been compromised and not start up anything until they were sure that the things that they were using, the collection, the people that they're tasking now, are truly not compromised. And to this day, do they know that the people that go back to that time period that they're still working with the United States, do they know that those people aren't compromised and that they are not working for the FBI? And the answer is no.
Amazing. And it's really funny that you bring up the Russian 10, because if I recall correctly, and I haven't looked at this in a while, but at least a couple of them, I believe one of the married couples was based in Montclair, New Jersey, which is really, really close to Wayne, New Jersey. Isn't it? I mean, just like a mile or two away.
So this is all public, and this is, again, with these stories, that's remarkable. The team that I worked with is the same team that received a National Intelligence Medal by the then director of the FBI and the director of counterintelligence for their work. So that should tell you probably a lot of what there is definitely a connection there.
Oh, wow. Okay. You were playing in the major leagues with those guys then.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
very cool.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So did you end up getting the letter of recommendation that you wanted in the beginning?
I did. And I have to tell you, it's like, it was such a letdown. And I love my time in the Navy and got to do some cool stuff, but nothing quite like this. And you and I were joking about this before this, but it's just, you come in, you're like, all right, I'm going to do that. And they're like, no, first you got to go 2 years of school, and you got this person to sign off this book and that book. And you're like, oh man, like, it's just, I didn't realize until it was over the kind of freedom. I'd sit down with the FBI and be like, hey man, why don't we go to Northrop Grumman and see if we can get some content that we can give the Russians there? And they're like, yeah, all right, let's do that. Like that, you can't do that in the military. You can't be like, hey, we want to run an op. We want to run some collection efforts against the Chinese. Let's go do this. Yeah, the number of people that have to sign off on that is like, it's just not happening.
Yeah, I can see that. They're like, great. You're a double agent with the FBI. Great. How's your PowerPoint skills?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But can you brief? That's the question.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see how it would be hard to top that experience with
It
anything
is.
else in life,
It is.
honestly. But I
It
mean, you went
is.
on, you had a career with the Navy, and you've moved on from there, I believe, now
Yep.
with your current work.
Yeah. 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 So it's, it's funny. People, I'm now being a journalist, and I joke with my old FBI. We still talk all the time, and he's the one that way back when I was operational. He's like, he told me that he could always tell when his agents were talking to me because they'd come into his office with their heads down, and be like, man, he's just frustrating the crap out of us. We have a good laugh about it now, but he's been a huge important mentor. And we're talking to him. I was like, being a journalist is like running spies. It's like you got sources, and now you got to deal with their their foibles. They're like, you got to sit down and like kind of coach them, and it's just a very consuming thing. And he's like laughing. He's like, yeah, man, that's exactly what it's like, is that, you're running assets and running sources like this, you got to manage them. And it's this. So in a lot of ways, being a spy really prepared me for working sources and doing that stuff in journalism.
Yeah, I
And
can
also
see the
just
crossover there.
totally. So yeah, it's just different kind of fun. And obviously I've sort of moved on from more traditional journalism to doing more like getting to do some really cool stuff with the
Oh yeah,
military,
yeah.
which I
Your life
love.
is action packed now, from the little bit that I've seen recently, anyway.
Yeah, I have a great time, and I don't say that I miss it, but it is definitely, yeah. Look, if there's anyone listening, and a young person who's interested in a career in the intelligence community, like what I would tell them, it is, and I'm sure you can appreciate this, right? Like the stuff that you do, it's very modest about it, but there are things that you get to see and things that you get to do that you will. It's not about the money, it's not about the career. Those are life experiences that you will never get anywhere else, no matter how
Mhm.
rich you are or what university you go to. And I would encourage people that intelligence, it can be soulfully crushing in the boredom, but then it can also not be. And you stick with it because of those times when it's not. And they do exist. And the things you get to see, the way that you get to see the world work is totally different. And man, you join the intelligence community because that's what you want to do.
Mhm.
So, I hope that if there are some young people, we need young, passionate people who are creative, who are willing to take a risk, who are smart, who like the challenge. And that's what, listen, Justin, we were better than the Russians. I mean, it wasn't just luck. We were better. And we need to make sure that our intelligence community remains better than our adversaries because, man, they've got their targets focused on us.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
you need to be vigilant in that. I know people don't see it every day, but it's here. It's happening all the time.
Hmm. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Awesome, fantastic. Well, this is an incredible story, Naveed. Are you have any big projects coming up that you can tell us about right now? A new book
Absolutely.
in the works or anything?
No, so my big push right now is a Newsweek show called Unconventional. You can find it. It's all being released on YouTube. We're sponsored by the Marine Corps Northrop Grumman. It's taken me from the Marine Expeditionary Unit, where I spent, and the USS 4, which I embarked on. It's the Navy's newest carrier, to flying in a Air Force B-52, which was wild, for 7 hours, to then be the 820th person to ever fly in a B-2 stealth bomber, which was absolutely bananas. It's a world that one of the things I left as sort of a ex-spy, if you will, is I want to share things that exist that most people don't necessarily get a chance to see because they should see it. They should be proud of it. So you can find it on Newsweek, newsweek.com/unconventional. And obviously on YouTube, just look for Unconventional. And yeah, we're super excited to keep doing this. I'm not spying against the Russians, but I feel like we're getting people sort of behind that velvet curtain, right? That sort of velvet rope to get an inside look at some pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the videos that you've been posting are just eye popping, honestly. So I'm really glad to see it. Do
Thank
you
you.
have like a personal website or social media accounts, anything like that that you want to
You
share with
can
people, or should they just find you on Unconventional?
Yeah, listen, you can find me on Threads, on Twitter, on Instagram. It's all Naveed Jamali. It's all the variation of the same, but pretty much anywhere. And listen, you follow me, you send me a question. I'm always happy to engage. And obviously, social media is a big thing now. So
Yeah,
yeah, you
yeah,
can, you
definitely.
can find me anywhere.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much. And for those of you who want to read the book, it is How to Catch a Russian Spy. Very descriptive title there. How to Catch a Russian Spy by Naveed Jamali. It's very, very enjoyable. Like I said, I finished it in just a few days myself. It's quite a story, and there is a lot that we haven't told about this
Yep.
story just during this interview. So you'll want to catch up and get the full scoop there, certainly. Naveed, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate
Hey,
it. It was great talking to you.
thanks for having me.
Absolutely. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.